Hi, this is Maggie. In this video, we're going to talk about input validation functions. This brief program obtains a value from the user, referenced by the variable num_stars. It validates the value in an input validation loop. The loop entry condition to an input validation loop describes invalid input. This program is looking for a value between 2 and 360 inclusive. So the loop entry condition describes the opposite values, less than 2 or greater than 360. The body of an input validation loop obtains a new input value. An input validation loop is exited when a valid value is entered. A simple validation condition with validation that occurs only once in a program can be written this way. However, if the validation is more complex, if it might change, or if there are many places in the program that require input validation to take place, then it makes sense to encapsulate that validation in a function. The function can be thoroughly tested, and it will ensure that all validation is consistent. This principle extends to writing secure code, where input from external systems should be considered potentially malicious. Suppose we substitute an input validation function for the loop entry condition of our input validation loop. We place it here, where the loop entry condition is, which means that the function must evaluate to a Boolean type. Let's first encapsulate this program in a main function and invoke main at the bottom of the file. I'll pause the video and do that. Okay, now let's write a header for the input validation function. The keyword def, and then the name of the function. An input validation function is often named so that the input validation loop reads a little bit like natural language. So while what? This will be a little bit awkward, but how about while not valid input? That describes when we're going into the loop, when the input isn't valid. And it might be easier to write a validation function that describes valid input so we don't make a mistake complementing the valid condition. So def valid input, and then we need the parameter list. Well, let's just start simple and pass the value in. So we'll call it value, and it's of type int. And then this evaluates to a bool. I'll pause the video and write a docstring for this function. Okay, now we want to return true if the input is valid and false otherwise. Our input is valid if it's within the range of 2 to 360 inclusive. The condition value greater than or equal to 2 and value less than or equal to 360 evaluates to true when the input is valid and false when it isn't, so we can return what that expression evaluates to, which is a Boolean. This input validation function is quite simple. Now, down in the main function where we want to validate the input, we can write while not valid input, and then pass in num_stars. And that's our condition. So it reads a little bit more naturally. And if we need to obtain and validate input in another part of the program, then we can use the same input validation function. This validation is extremely simple. Ideally, we would validate the type of the input and the range. And here we are assuming the user enters data of the correct type and validating the range only. Validating the type is accomplished in Python through exception handling, which we are not covering here. The focus here is on writing an input validation function and getting comfortable with the idea of writing and using a function that returns a Boolean. Our function is not very general, so we'll make it a little more general so that it can validate any integer falling within any range. The way to do that is to add the range to the list of parameters, use them in the function, and pass the range in as arguments. So I'll add min range and max range. Oops. Both of type int to the parameter list and replace the 2 and the 360 with those variables. Down where we're calling the function, I'll pass in 2 and 360. And if I run the program, you can see I'm trapped if I enter values below 2 or above 360. But this function is more general. I can invoke the function here in the console and enter, for example, the value 100 and the range 1 to 10, and the function returns false. I can enter the value 100 and the range 1 to 100, and the function returns true. So I could use this in different parts of a program that need a value to be within different ranges. To practice with this, I recommend you take programs with input validation loops and write them with input validation functions. Remember to test thoroughly. Test values within the range, on the edges, and outside. When you've successfully written a variety of input validation functions, you're ready to move on.